the FMLA guerrillas had women army fighters. Okay, read you just a short piece from Valiant Women, compilation of women in various military activities around the world. This is a woman in El Salvador who was a university student, and she quit the university after some relatives and friends had been killed by the army, and she joined the guerrillas. I'll read a little quotation from her. "I have fought many times, but the first time was not easy. I had to keep in mind that these people who had killed someone in my family, and as long as I kept thinking about that, I could kill them. While I was waiting, just as she gets in, just before an ambush, while I was waiting, I thought, I cannot. Then, when the convoy came, I knew I could. There is no choice but to kill. You have to demonstrate to your compañeros that you can. You know everybody is scared. If you ran away, others might do the same, and it would be your fault." In Africa, national liberation women fighters existed in Rhodesia, where there were 4,000 women combatants, which composed 6% of the liberation forces. In South Africa, in the 1980s, women were 10% of the armed wing of the ANC. In Eritrea, and this is not in guerrilla, but it's covered in Africa. During the Eritrean-Ethiopian War, which lasted from the 1960s to the 1990s, women were 35% of the army and 25% of the infantry. Because of our Eritreans in this area, I did my best to interview some Eritrean women, and I interviewed about 5 of them. And they all told me the same thing. They said that the greatest period of their lives was when they fought in the army. And I said, why? I said, well, they said, that's the only time we were equal to men. And not only that, it's the only time when women commanded platoons, companies, battalions, and even regiments made up of mostly men. Okay? 'Cause they fought in integrated units. Okay? And then after the war, they said, well, when I was demobilized, I went back to the house. And there, the husband was the boss. And if I worked outside the home, the man was the boss in the workplace. He said, that's why that's why it was the best time of my life. I'll give you other examples of just a few. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, 1/3 of their 15,000 fighters were women. Well, although they're mostly known for suicide bombings, they also were involved in combat. In the Congo Republic in the 90s, guerrilla militias included women fighters and commanders. They were so good that, again, like in Dahomey, the men dressed in women's clothing in order to get the combat ardor of women. One other quick example. In World War II, there was a study of partisan women, and a book was written called Partisanos. One woman went to Italy, Greece, Denmark, and one other country to interview women. And she couldn't find women right away. So she thought, well, I'll speak to males who fought in the partisan army. Maybe they can, lead me to the women. So she'd go into the house, and there would be this guy sitting there. You're talking about guys that they were in their 50s, 60s by then. And the wife would be like serving them coffee, right? Serving them pastry, and then kind of like sitting off in a corner and so forth. And so she would ask the woman that was there, she said, oh, because the guy was describing all the things that he was doing, and she turned to the woman, she said, by the way, what did you do during the war? And I said, oh, he said, that's what my husband in the resistance movement in this town. Well, I said, oh, that's interesting. What did you do? Well, I killed the head of the SS in my town. I blew up railroad tracks. I carried weapons under my clothes. I was involved in a couple of raids, freeing our comrades from jail. And occasionally I was involved in attacks on German troops. Right? And that's, right? So that's why she said, the writer said that then she would ask the woman if she knew other women who were involved. And then from there she went on and on and on and on. Okay? But again, it's kind of like a change of the woman's role during the war and after the war. So the conclusion on guerrilla war, women are more common in warrior roles than in conventional armies. Yet when the women are demobilized, they tend to go into traditional roles. Okay, individual women fighters. The most widespread involvement of women warriors has been as individuals scattered throughout the ranks and are found in many cultures around the world. Again, give you one prominent example, which is not talked about too often, but which women have especially been writing about, and that's cross-dressing women. Women disguised as men. From the 1600s to the 1900s, especially in Asia, Europe, and the United States, women dressed as male soldiers. In 1762 in England, the joke was there were so many disguised women in the army that they could form their own regiments. Disguised women have been documented in the militaries of China, Austria, France, England, and the US, among many others. Half of the documented cases, half a dozen documented cases of women dressed as men fighting in the U.S. Continental Army were in the Revolutionary War. One very prominent case, which really struck out at me in England, was there was a field surgeon. This was in the late 1700s, early 1800s. A field surgeon, okay? And that is one who operated on the wounded right behind the lines. And the field surgeon eventually rose in rank and became a general and head of the medical service of the British Army, and instituted reforms which modernized the medical service, the Army. Retired general. 5 years after retirement, he dies. Okay? Goes to the funeral home, right? And the undertaker discovers that the male general is a woman. Or else I won't tell this story, all right? But I'm saying it was that common when they say regiments of women who were disguised as men in England could be, discovered. In the Civil War, U.S. Civil War, it's very interesting. Every time I read a book about it, the closer it is to the present date, the more the number of documented cases of women dressed as men emerge. In the last book I read that came out about 2 years ago, it was up to 1,000 women who were dressed as men. Okay? They would go in again to be close to their husbands or lovers. They would, I give you an example of how they found. There was one nurse who was a regimental nurse, and she said that in 2 years they found 101 women dressed as men in that regiment. They found them because they were wounded and discovered. They were dead on the battlefield and were discovered. Okay? Or some were otherwise discovered. Okay? Many women who were discovered when they were kicked out of one regiment, they'd move to another regiment and enlist. Okay? So the total is really unknown yet. It's still being documented more and more. Because I read in the beginning, a few hundred, right? Then a few more hundred, and a few more hundred, then up to 1,000, and they're still trying to document all the cases. Okay? Also, another instance is women at sea. Women at sea. Some women at sea were dressed as men. Others did support work on the ships. That is, they were the cooks, the tailors, and I'm talking about men of war ships. Okay, I'm not talking about commercial ships. I'm talking about warships. There were nurses, and they carried gunpowder to the cannons. Some were the wives of the officers or their girlfriends. Some were just aboard to do, the support work. The British Navy between the 17th and 19th centuries had many women that accompanied men on warships. Of course, when there were sea battles, these women are obviously forced into being, forced into combat. But a more interesting story, at least to me, is that the women who would bring the bags of powder from storage to the cannons during battles. Okay, when men were killed or otherwise incapacitated in gun crews, if the gun was serviceable, the women were expected to join the gun crews to fire upon the enemy ships. Now, if movies were made about many of these things that I'm talking about, you're liable to think they're fiction, but they weren't. And I've never seen a British man of war, a movie about a British man of war. Have you ever seen one where you had all these women doing all these things on board ship, right? And then manning guns in certain situations? You never see women on board those ships. Next, I'll mention something about openly women women fighters who were openly women, obviously women. Let me go back a little into clan and tribal societies. In clan and tribal societies, there were records of individual women fighters in the Maori, that's in New Zealand, the Apache, Cheyenne, Shasta, Northern California, Klamath, Choctaw, Conchow, okay? They were also found in certain tribal societies in Brazil, South America, Brazil, Central America, Africa, and this does not include the women who accompanied the warriors but did not fight. I call them the cleanup women, which could often be kind of gruesome. They did. And again, I could name you a dozen countries that are documented, or a dozen tribes that were documented where they did those roles. Women warriors were found among the Celtics, as reported by the Romans in the 1st century AD, and some of the Celtic women also led men in battle. In industrial capitalist societies, especially the early ones, individual women were found as fighters in the French Civil Wars. Spanish female guerrillas fought the French in 1808. French women are found here and there throughout the French forces in battles in Corsica in 1792 to 99. In the U.S. Civil War, I mentioned before women as men, but women were found openly as officers in the Confederate Army. There were at least half a dozen women who served in the Confederate Army as officers. Most of them, I might add, were in charge of women who were partisans, that is, women who were in the Union-occupied part of the Confederacy, okay? They formed all-women units under women leaders, and they would lead raids, say, to free prisoners. They would lead raids on camps of Union soldiers, okay, as well as being involved in spying, individual assassinations, and things like this.
Excuse me. I just happened to think of something.
A little louder.
Oh, were there women in the Union Army?
Yeah, the majority of disguised women were in the Union Army. At least of the data that we have. You've got poor data on the Confederates in terms of disguised women. That's why I say most of the women that we know about were women guerrillas who fought in the Confederates. Almost through, folks. I'm going to mention something about the Paris Commune, because that's, well, popular in the North, right? And I don't have to say too much about the Paris Commune, because I assume you know it existed. Oh, wait a minute. Let me double back. Sorry. In talking about women in the U.S. Civil War, one of the more famous ones who doesn't really get that much credit in popular mind is someone who a movie was just released about. Harriet Tubman, right? Harriet Tubman. Now, she's given about 15 seconds at the end of the movie where all of a sudden you see her. She was on a river, and you see these Union ships in the background. How many saw the movie, incidentally? Anybody?
Yeah, I saw a preview.
Okay. Well, in the preview, it shows it for a half a second. Okay? So, and it shows her and all the black infantry troops on boats behind her coming in. And she's standing there with a rifle, right? And then you see the Confederates on the riverbanks, right? And she pulls the rifle up as if to shoot, right? And that's the end of that scene. And then it goes into about 2.5 minutes covering, saying that she was in the Civil War and then talking about her life after the Civil War, all right? The majority of the film was about her other exploits, okay? What is not known, okay, is that she was considered to be one of the leading figures in the Civil War, leading individuals in the Civil War. Okay. Her whole freeing of the slaves was a form of guerrilla warfare. It laid the basis for her later actions in the Civil War. She had a whole network of spies from Maryland to South Carolina. Okay. She was the head of military intelligence of the Army of the Potomac. General Grant said that she was the best intelligence officer in the whole Union Army. Okay? She led, you know, in that scene where she's, you know, she's with these, on a boat, you know, landing with the troop. She was the only woman who led, well, actually, not just led, she planned, organized, and led an amphibious assault. The only woman in the United States who had, possibly the only woman in the world who has. Right? And I hope to give a talk next year about Harriet Tubman and, as a woman warrior. Okay? Even John Brown, another thing that's not mentioned often is that she helped John Brown, she had close relationships with. Okay? And John Brown, she helped him with the planning the raid on Harper's Ferry. Okay? John Brown described her as the best military mind that he ever met. Okay? Now, if you don't believe that, I have the experts to tell you that.
What's that?
Harriet Tubman, servant leader, that's serve the people leader, that's what it means. Okay?
Put it up.
This was a booklet published a couple of years ago by the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College. All right? That's the outfit that trains mid-level officers to become senior-level officers. And in there, it covers her life, but it focuses on her military achievements, both as a leader in amphibious warfare, as an intelligence officer, and as a leader. Okay, and in the very end, it says the Marines should emulate her as a leader, certain traits that they list. Okay, so that, I say, is the ultimate tribute to her as a military person, when the military accepts you as in that role. Okay, now, the final thing I want to talk about, because I won't have enough time to deal with the two cases of the Soviet Union and Cuba, which I've discussed before. Okay, I was going to throw it in if I had time, but I don't. Okay, and that is the category of women as military leaders. Excluding leaders who were disguised as men, we have such persons, probably the most well-known is Joan of Arc. However, a category of women who were military leaders who are not talked about so much, except among women historians, are queens. Queens were schooled in warfare since they led the armed forces of their subjects. And this was found both in, well, it's found in countries such as ancient Assyria, Babylonia, Egypt, Persia, Britain, Syria, Tuscany, medieval England, Georgia, Spain, Vietnam, the Trong sisters, India, Angola, Persia. Okay. Now, since the queens were the head of their armed forces, and in those days, the queens, and I'm talking about from ancient slave societies to feudal societies, the queens led their forces in battle. They had to have some knowledge of warfare, okay? Some knowledge of planning, okay? Some knowledge of leading, okay? Which was the same that the kings had. Okay? But there's another category of women that is also not frequently talked about, and that is the castle defenders. When the husbands, i.e. kings, were off fighting, sometimes the armies that they were fighting thought, you know, if we give just like a pro forma force against the king's forces, but then take our majority of our forces and capture the castle, right? So what the queens did, they were in charge of defending the castle, okay? And I say that this occurred both in Asia and Europe. There are numerous recorded instances where women in the castles donned armor, where the queens mobilized other women to rain down on the attackers stones, boiling tar, using bows and arrows on the attackers. And if the attackers got into the castle, that they fought them with swords and daggers. Right? So that the women within the castle, led by the queen, okay, were the combatants. So, in conclusion, while women have either been kept out of the military or functioned in military support roles, many also functioned in combat. The bolder conclusion is that I really have no conclusions other than some of the generalizations that I've already made. You should draw your own conclusions about what I've said. And I'll tell you two things. The question, if you look at the historical record, the question is not can women fight, not should women fight, but women have fought and women will continue to fight in the future. So it's Jean's turn, and thank you.